The November rain drummed against my Honda Civic's windshield as I pulled into the circular driveway of Brooke's house in Myers Park. Even through the gray afternoon drizzle, the place looked like something out of a magazine. White columns, perfectly manicured lawn, and those expensive-looking lanterns flanking the front door. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my palms suddenly sweaty despite the cool weather. "Mommy, is this where Aunt Brooke lives?" Ava's voice piped up from the back seat, her face pressed against the window. At 6 years old, she still had that wide-eyed wonder about everything, even my sister's intimidating mansion. "Yes, sweetheart. Remember what we talked about? We're going to have a nice dinner with Aunt Brooke and Uncle Richard, and you're going to meet your cousins, Madison and Tyler." I caught her reflection in the rearview mirror, her dark curls bouncing as she nodded enthusiastically, wearing the navy blue dress I'd splurged on at Target last week. It had taken 3 months of saving, setting aside $20 here and there from my paycheck at the dental office where I worked as a receptionist. But seeing her excitement made every sacrifice worth it. The truth was, I hadn't spoken to Brooke in over 2 years, not since the divorce, when everything fell apart, and I had to move back to Charlotte with nothing but a suitcase and a broken heart. Brooke had made it clear then that my life choices weren't something she wanted to be associated with. Her exact words were burned into my memory. "Danielle, you need to figure out your life before you drag the family name through the mud." But last week, out of nowhere, she'd called. "I've been thinking," she'd said in that polished voice of hers, the one she'd perfected during her sorority days at Duke. "It's been too long. Why don't you and Ava come for Thanksgiving? Richard's parents will be here, and the kids would love to meet their cousin." I should have known there was a catch. With Brooke, there always was. As I turned off the engine, I could see warm light spilling from the windows and shadows of people moving inside. My stomach twisted with that familiar mixture of hope and dread that seemed to define most of my interactions with my older sister. Growing up, Brooke had been the golden child. Straight A's, homecoming queen, full scholarship to Duke, and then a perfect marriage to Richard Hall, whose family owned half the commercial real estate in Charlotte. Meanwhile, I'd been the dreamer, the one who dropped out of college to follow my ex-husband to California, thinking love would be enough to build a life on. How wrong I'd been. "Come on, baby girl," I said, unbuckling my seatbelt and reaching for the bottle of wine I'd brought, a $15 Pinot Grigio that had seemed reasonable until I remembered that Richard probably had a wine cellar worth more than my annual salary. The front door opened before we even reached the porch, and there was Brooke, looking like she'd stepped out of a holiday catalog. Her blonde hair was styled in perfect waves, and she wore a cream-colored cashmere sweater that probably cost more than my monthly rent. But it was her smile that made my chest tighten, bright and practiced, the kind she used at charity galas and country club events. "Danielle, you made it." She air-kissed both my cheeks, her perfume enveloping me in a cloud of expensive florals. And this must be little Ava. My goodness, and hasn't she grown? Ava hid behind my legs, suddenly shy. I couldn't blame her. Brooke had that effect on people, all polished perfection and barely contained judgment. "Thank you for having us," I said, holding out the wine. "I know it's been a while." Brooke's eyes flicked to the bottle, and I caught the microscopic pause before she took it. How thoughtful. Come in, come in. Everyone's dying to meet you both." The inside of the house was even more impressive than the outside. Marble floors, a crystal chandelier that probably cost more than my car, and the kind of furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum. Everything was beige and cream and gold, coordinated within an inch of its life. I felt suddenly self-conscious about my own outfit, a black dress from Kohl's that I'd worn to every important occasion for the past 3 years. "Richard!" Brooke called out in a sing-song voice. "They're here!" Richard appeared from what I assumed was his study, a tall man with graying temples, and the kind of confident bearing that came with inherited wealth. He'd always been polite to me, but distant, like I was some unfortunate relative he had to tolerate for his wife's sake. "Danielle, good to see you," he said, shaking my hand with the firm grip of someone who'd closed a lot of business deals. "And you must be Ava. I hear you're in 1st grade now." Before Ava could answer, 2 children came thundering down the curved staircase. Madison, who looked about 8, and Tyler, maybe 10. Both had that same golden-haired, well-fed look as their parents, wearing clothes that probably came from boutiques I'd never heard of. "Kids, this is your Aunt Danielle and your cousin Ava," Brooke announced, her hands on her children's shoulders like she was presenting prize-winning show dogs. Madison looked at Ava with the kind of curious appraisal that only children could manage, while Tyler mumbled a barely audible hello before asking if he could go back to his video game. Tyler, manners, Richard said sharply, and the boy straightened up with the automatic response of someone used to being corrected. It's nice to meet you, Ava, Madison said, with the careful politeness of a child who'd been coached. Do you want to see my room? I have a dollhouse that's bigger than you. For the first time since we'd arrived. Ava perked up, nodding eagerly. As the girls headed upstairs, I felt some of the tension leave my shoulders. Maybe this would be okay. Maybe Brooke really had changed, and this invitation had been genuine. Let me get you something to drink, Brooke said, guiding me toward what I assumed was the kitchen. We have wine, cocktails, sparkling water. Wine would be great, I said, following her through a dining room that looked like it could seat 20 people. The table was already set with china that probably had its own insurance policy, and there were enough crystal glasses to stock a restaurant. The kitchen was a masterpiece of marble countertops and professional-grade appliances, the kind of space where I could imagine cooking shows being filmed. Brooke poured wine from a bottle that definitely hadn't come from the grocery store, and I tried not to think about how the glass probably cost more than my entire dinner contribution. And so, she said, settling against the island with the practiced ease of someone comfortable in their domain. Tell me everything. How's work? Are you still at that dental office? There it was, the subtle emphasis on that, like working at Dr. Martinez's practice was somehow beneath consideration. But I kept my voice steady, determined not to let her get under my skin. Yes, I'm still there. Dr. Martinez is wonderful to work for, and the hours are good for Ava's school schedule. I took a sip of wine, tasting something complex and expensive. What about you? Still with the junior league? Oh, that and so much more, Brooke said, launching into a detailed account of her various charitable committees, her role as room mother for both kids and classes, and the charity gala she was planning for the spring. As she talked, I found myself studying her face, looking for traces of the sister I'd grown up with, the one who used to sneak into my room during thunderstorms, who'd taught me how to braid friendship bracelets, who'd cried with me when our parents divorced when I was 12. But that girl seemed to have disappeared somewhere along the way, replaced by this polished stranger who measured everything by appearance and social standing. Mommy! Ava's voice called from upstairs, followed by the sound of running feet. She appeared in the kitchen doorway, her cheeks flushed with excitement. Madison has a princess castle, and she said I can play with it after dinner. That's wonderful, sweetheart, I said, pulling her close for a quick hug. Are you having fun? Uh-huh. And Tyler showed me his PlayStation, and he said maybe he'll let me try it later if I'm good. Brooke smiled, but I caught something in her expression, a tightness around her eyes that made my stomach clench with familiar dread. Actually, she said, her voice taking on that carefully modulated tone I remembered from our childhood, the one that meant she was about to deliver bad news with a smile. I should probably explain how dinner is going to work tonight. The wine turned sour in my mouth. What do you mean? Well, we have Richard's parents here, and a few family friends, the Weatherbys and the Montgomerys. You remember them from my wedding. Anyway, the main dining room table is really set up for the adults and older children. Madison and Tyler will be sitting there because, well, they know how to behave appropriately in front of company. Each word hit me like a small slap. I set my wine glass down carefully, afraid I might drop it. I've set up a lovely little table in the sunroom for you and Ava, Brooke continued, her smile never wavering. It's much more comfortable for families with small children. Less formal, you know? Ava will be able to relax and just be herself, without worrying about all the adult conversation and expectations. The room seemed to tilt slightly. You want us to eat separately? It's not separate, Brooke said quickly, though her voice had that defensive edge I remembered from when we were kids, and she'd been caught doing something wrong. It's just more appropriate. Richard's parents are quite traditional, and with the Weatherbys there, well, James just made partner at his firm, and they're very particular about atmosphere. I stared at my sister, this woman who'd grown up in the same house as me, who'd played the same games and shared the same parents, and felt something cold and hard settle in my chest. This wasn't about Ava's age or behavior. This was about us not being good enough, not fitting into the carefully curated image Brooke had built for herself. Ava is 6 years old, I said, fighting to keep my voice level. She knows how to use a fork and say please and thank you. She's not going to embarrass you. Of course not. Brooke's laugh was bright and false. It's not about embarrassment. It's about what's comfortable for everyone. You'll still be part of the dinner. The sunroom connects right to the dining room. You'll hear all the conversation, and we can all visit back and forth. It's actually quite cozy. Cozy. Like we were children being relegated to the kids' table, except there weren't any other kids being sent away. Just us. Just the sister who'd made poor life choices, and her daughter who apparently wasn't worthy of sitting with the respectable people. I thought about walking out. I imagined taking Ava's hand, thanking Brooke politely for the invitation, and driving home to the small apartment where we'd eat macaroni and cheese while watching the Macy's parade. It would have been the smart thing to do, the self-respecting thing to do. But then I looked at Ava, still glowing with excitement about the Princess Castle and the promise of maybe playing video games later. She'd been so excited about meeting her cousins, had talked about it for days. And despite everything, I still harbored some foolish hope that maybe, somehow, this dinner could be the beginning of repairing the rift in our family. So I swallowed my pride, felt it go down like broken glass, and forced a smile. "That sounds fine," I said. "Whatever works best for everyone." Brooke's relief was palpable. "Wonderful. I knew you'd understand. You always were the flexible one." Flexible. That was one way to put it. As we walked back toward the front of the house, I caught a glimpse through the dining room doors of the main table. Elegant place settings, crystal stemware catching the light from the chandelier, and name cards written in Brooke's perfect calligraphy. Even from a distance, I could see the careful arrangement, the obvious thought that had gone into making everything perfect for her important guests. None of whom would have to share their Thanksgiving dinner with the family disappointment and her child. The sunroom, when Brooke showed it to us, was actually lovely. Floor-to-ceiling windows, comfortable wicker furniture, and a small round table set for two with cheerful yellow placemats. Under different circumstances, I might have preferred it to the formal dining room. But circumstances were everything, and these circumstances made it feel like exactly what it was: exile. "See?" Brooke said brightly. "Isn't this nice?" Much more relaxed. "It's perfect," I lied, watching Ava explore the room with the enthusiasm she brought to every new experience. At least one of us was still capable of finding joy in small things. As the afternoon wore on and more guests arrived, I found myself observing the careful choreography of Brooke's social world. The Weatherbys were exactly as I remembered, polished and self-important, the kind of people who dropped names and talked about their vacation to Europe like it was a humanitarian mission. The Montgomerys were newer to me, but cut from the same cloth, discussing their children's private schools and their latest kitchen renovation, with the casual assumption that everyone lived the same privileged life. Richard's parents, Harold and Patricia Hall, were the crown jewels of the evening, old Charlotte money with the kind of understated elegance that didn't need to announce itself. Patricia wore pearls that had probably been in the family for generations, and Harold had the bearing of a man who'd never had to worry about money a day in his life. And through it all, Brooke played the perfect hostess, flitting from group to group with practiced ease, making sure everyone's glass was full and every conversation flowed smoothly. She was good at it, I had to admit. This was her world, and she ruled it with the kind of gracious authority that came naturally to her. But every now and then, I caught her glancing toward the sunroom where Ava and I sat, and I saw something in her expression that made my chest tight. Not guilt, exactly, but a kind of careful calculation, like she was constantly measuring the social cost of our presence against the family obligation she felt bound to honor. When dinner was finally served, I understood the true scope of what we'd been excluded from. Through the open doorway between the sunroom and dining room, I could see the main table in all its glory. A turkey that belonged in a Norman Rockwell painting, sides that looked like they'd been prepared by a professional chef, and wine that probably cost more per bottle than I spent on groceries in a month. Our dinner, served on cheerful pottery plates that didn't match the fine china in the other room, was perfectly adequate. The same turkey, the same sides, even the same wine. But eating it while watching the real party happen 20 feet away felt like pressing my nose against the window of a restaurant I couldn't afford. Ava, bless her heart, seemed oblivious to the slight. She chattered happily about Madison's dollhouse, about the pretty dishes, about how fancy everything looked. Her innocent joy was both heartbreaking and infectious, reminding me why I'd swallowed my pride in the first place. But as the evening progressed and the wine flowed freely in the dining room, the conversations grew louder and more animated. I heard laughter, animated discussions about business and travel, and the kind of casual mentions of expensive things that marked conversations among people who'd never had to worry about money. and I realized that Brooke had been wrong about one thing. We couldn't really hear all the conversation from where we sat. We could hear the sound of it, the music of inclusion, but we were definitively outside it, separated by more than just a doorway. It was during dessert, a spectacular pumpkin tart that had clearly been made by someone far more skilled than any home baker, that I heard Patricia Hall's voice rise above the general conversation. "Brooke, dear, you really have outdone yourself tonight. Everything is absolutely perfect. Thank you so much, Mrs. Hall," came Brooke's voice, warm with pleasure at the compliment. I just wanted everyone to feel welcome and comfortable. Welcome and comfortable. The words hit me like a physical blow, and I found myself gripping my coffee cup so hard I was surprised it didn't shatter. That's when I heard it, a sound that would change everything that was about to happen, though I didn't know it yet. A car door slamming in the driveway, followed by hurried footsteps on the front porch. "Who could that be?" I heard Richard ask, his voice carrying a note of annoyance at the interruption of his perfect evening. And then the doorbell rang, sharp and insistent in the carefully orchestrated calm of Brooke's Thanksgiving dinner. The doorbell rang again, more urgently this time, and I heard chairs scraping against the hardwood floor as someone got up to answer it. From my position in the sunroom, I couldn't see the front door, but I could hear everything. The click of expensive heels on marble, the sound of the door opening, and then a voice that made my blood run cold. "Is Brooke Cooper Hall here? I need to speak with her immediately." The voice was female, professional, and carried an authority that cut through the wine-warmed atmosphere of the dinner party like a knife. I heard the conversations in the dining room falter and die, replaced by the kind of awkward silence that meant everyone was straining to listen. "I'm Brooke," came my sister's voice, tight with confusion and barely concealed irritation. "And you are Detective Sarah Chen, Charlotte Mecklenburg Police Department. I need to speak with you about your husband, Richard Hall." The coffee cup slipped from my hands, hitting the wicker table with a sharp clink. Ava looked up from her coloring book, her crayon suspended mid-stroke. "Mommy, what's wrong?" "Nothing, sweetheart," I whispered, but my heart was hammering against my ribs. Through the doorway, I could see the edge of the dining room, where the perfect tableau of Thanksgiving dinner had suddenly frozen like a photograph. "I'm sorry, Detective, but I don't understand." Brooke's voice had taken on that careful, controlled tone she used when she was trying to manage a situation. "Richard is right here. There must be some mistake. Mr. Hall, I'm going to need you to come with me for questioning in connection with the embezzlement investigation at Morrison Development Group." The words hit the dining room like a bomb. I heard Patricia Hall's sharp intake of breath. James Weatherby's muttered, "Jesus Christ," and then Richard's voice, no longer smooth and confident, but shaky with panic. "This is ridiculous. I demand to know what this is about. I'm calling my lawyer." "You're certainly entitled to do that, sir," Detective Chen replied, her voice professionally neutral. "But I have a warrant for your arrest, and you need to come with me now." What happened next was like watching a perfectly constructed house of cards collapse in slow motion. I heard Brooke's voice, high and desperate. "There has to be a mistake. Richard would never. He's one of the most respected businessmen in Charlotte." But Detective Chen's response was measured and final. "Ma'am, your husband has been under investigation for 6 months. We have evidence of systematic embezzlement totaling over $2 million from client accounts. There's also evidence suggesting he's been using company funds to maintain a lifestyle beyond his legitimate means." The silence that followed was deafening. Then Harold Hall's voice, cold as winter. "Richard, what is this woman talking about?" "Dad, I can explain. It's not what it looks like." "Mr. Hall," Detective Chen interrupted, "you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As the Miranda rights continued, I heard Brooke's voice crack completely. "This can't be happening. Not tonight. Not in front of everyone." Even from the sunroom, I could feel the social catastrophe unfolding in the dining room. These people, the Weatherbys, the Montgomerys, Harold and Patricia Hall, they lived in a world where reputation was everything, where being associated with scandal could destroy carefully cultivated social standing. And here was Brooke, who had spent the entire evening orchestrating the perfect image, watching it all crumble in front of the very people she'd been trying to impress. "Mommy, why is everyone being so loud?" Ava whispered, her eyes wide with confusion. "Sometimes grown-ups have problems they need to work out," I said, pulling her closer to me on the wicker love seat. "And it's going to be okay." But even as I said it, I could hear that it very much wasn't going to be okay. At least not for Brooke. I heard footsteps, the sound of handcuffs clicking, a sound I'd only heard in movies but that was unmistakably real, and then Richard's voice, pleading and desperate. "Brooke, call David Steinberg. Tell him what happened. And for God's sake, don't let the kids see this." The front door opened and closed, and then there was silence, except for the ticking of an expensive clock somewhere in the house. After what felt like an eternity, I heard Patricia Hall's voice, cold and cutting. "Well, I think it's time Harold and I returned home. Please," Brooke's voice was barely above a whisper. "Please don't. This isn't... Richard is a good man. There has to be an explanation." "I'm sure there is," Harold Hall replied, his tone making it clear that he didn't expect that explanation to be in Richard's favor. "We'll be in touch about arrangements for the children." The implications of that statement hit like a sledgehammer. Harold and Patricia weren't just leaving. They were already thinking about custody, about protecting their grandchildren from the scandal that was about to engulf their parents. More footsteps, more voices saying polite, but cold goodbyes. The Weatherbys and Montgomerys were fleeing like rats from a sinking ship, their social calculus already determining that association with the Halls was now a liability rather than an asset. Within 15 minutes, the house that had been full of laughter and conversation was eerily quiet. I sat in the sunroom with Ava, unsure whether to leave, to stay, or to pretend this had never happened. Finally, I heard Brooke's heels clicking slowly across the marble floor, and she appeared in the doorway to the sunroom. She looked like a different person. Her perfect hair was disheveled, her makeup smudged from tears, and her cashmere sweater had a stain on it. Wine, maybe, or gravy from when her hands had been shaking. But it was her eyes that were the most changed. The confident, judgmental gleam was gone, replaced by something raw and desperate. "Danielle," she said, her voice hoarse. I need..." She stopped, looking at me and Ava sitting together on the love seat, and I saw the exact moment when the irony hit her. Here she was, the woman who'd just spent the evening treating us like we weren't good enough to sit at her table, now standing in her designer clothes and ruined makeup, needing something from the sister she'd just humiliated. "The kids," she whispered. "Madison and Tyler are upstairs. They heard everything. I don't know what to tell them." I looked at my sister, really looked at her, and felt something shift inside my chest. Not satisfaction, exactly, because there was no joy in seeing another person's world collapse, but there was a kind of cosmic justice in the moment, a rebalancing of scales that had been weighted against me for so long I'd forgotten what equilibrium felt like. "Where are they now?" I asked quietly. "Madison's room. They're scared and confused, and I..." She broke off, pressing her hands to her face. "God, Danielle, what am I going to do? Richard's been arrested, at Thanksgiving dinner, in front of the Halls, in front of everyone. My life is over. Your life isn't over," I said, standing up and smoothing down my Kohl's dress. "But it's definitely going to be different." Brooke looked at me through her fingers, and I saw something I hadn't seen in years. Vulnerability. Real, honest vulnerability, not the calculated helplessness she sometimes performed to get what she wanted. "I know I have no right to ask," she said, her voice barely audible. "After tonight, after how but could you help me with the kids? Just until I figure out what to say to them?" I thought about it. I thought about the separate table, about the careful explanation of why Ava wasn't good enough to sit with the respectable people, about years of being treated like the family failure. I thought about walking away, about taking Ava home and letting Brooke deal with the consequences of her perfect life falling apart. But then I looked at Ava, who was watching everything with those big, curious eyes, and I thought about Madison and Tyler upstairs, probably huddled together trying to make sense of what they'd heard. "Ava," I said, "would you like to go upstairs and see if Madison and Tyler want to play a game or watch a movie?" My daughter nodded eagerly, always ready to help, and I took her hand. "Come on, let's go see your cousins." As we headed toward the staircase, I felt Brooke following behind us, and I realized that for the first time in years, maybe decades, I was the one in control. I was the one with something to offer. The one whose life, modest and imperfect as it was, wasn't currently falling apart. Madison and Tyler were indeed in Madison's room, sitting together on her pink canopy bed. Madison was crying quietly, and Tyler was trying to look brave but failing. The princess castle that Ava had been so excited about sat forgotten in the corner. "Hey guys," I said softly, stepping into the room. "That was pretty scary downstairs, huh?" Madison nodded, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. Is Daddy in trouble? I glanced back at Brooke, who was hovering in the doorway looking lost. This was her job, her responsibility, but she seemed paralyzed by the magnitude of what had just happened. Your daddy has some grown-up problems he needs to work out, I said, sitting down on the edge of the bed. Sometimes that happens, even to good people. It doesn't mean he doesn't love you, and it doesn't mean you did anything wrong. Are they going to take him to jail? Tyler asked, his voice small and scared. Brooke made a choked sound from the doorway, but I kept my voice steady. He might have to go away for a while to sort things out. But no matter what happens, you have your mom, and you have family who loves you. Ava, with the intuitive kindness that 6-year-olds sometimes possess, climbed up onto the bed and sat between her cousins. When my daddy left, I was really sad, she said matter-of-factly. But then Mommy and I got our own apartment, and we have movie nights every Friday, and sometimes we eat ice cream for dinner. It's not so bad. Madison looked at Ava with something like wonder. You eat ice cream for dinner? Only sometimes, Ava clarified seriously. When we've had a really hard day, Mommy says sometimes you need sugar to make your heart feel better. And just like that, the tension in the room shifted. Not gone, but softened somehow by a 6-year-old's simple honesty about how families could be broken and still work, how life could be imperfect and still contain moments of sweetness. Hey, can we watch a movie? Madison asked, her voice still shaky but hopeful. I think that's a great idea, I said, standing up. Why don't you guys pick something good, and I'll make some popcorn. As I headed downstairs to the kitchen, I passed Brooke in the hallway. She was leaning against the wall, her perfect composure completely shattered. Thank you, she whispered as I walked by. I don't know how to... We'll figure it out, I said, and kept walking. The kitchen, which had been the scene of such careful orchestration just hours before, now looked like a battlefield. Dirty dishes were piled everywhere, the remains of the perfect Thanksgiving dinner scattered across marble countertops. The expensive wine bottle sat empty next to my $15 contribution, which hadn't even been opened. As I searched through cabinets for microwave popcorn, I found myself thinking about the strange turns life could take. This morning, I'd been the family disappointment, the one whose presence had to be carefully managed and contained. Now, I was the stable one, the one with something to offer in a crisis. It wasn't that I was happy about Richard's arrest. I wouldn't wish that kind of catastrophe on anyone, and I certainly didn't want Madison and Tyler to suffer. But there was something undeniably satisfying about the way the evening had unfolded, the way Brooke's careful social calculations had been rendered meaningless by forces beyond her control. I found the popcorn and put a bag in the microwave, listening to the familiar sound of kernels popping while I thought about what came next. Brooke would need practical help, someone to watch the kids while she dealt with lawyers and police and the media circus that was bound to follow. She'd need emotional support as her perfect world crumbled around her. She'd need family, and for the first time in years, I was in a position to be that family, not as the grateful recipient of her charity, but as an equal, someone whose own experience with life falling apart might actually be valuable. The microwave beeped, and I pulled out the bag of popcorn, the smell filling the empty kitchen. Upstairs, I could hear the sounds of a movie starting, children's voices mixing together as they settled in for whatever Disney film they'd chosen. When I got back to Madison's room with the popcorn, I found all 3 kids snuggled together on the big bed, watching Moana on the flat-screen TV. Brooke was sitting in the corner chair, her designer clothes wrinkled, her perfect hair falling in her face, but her eyes fixed on her children with an expression I recognized, the fierce, protective love of a mother whose world had just shifted on its axis. She looked up when I came in, and for a moment, our eyes met across the pink and gold room. In that look, I saw something I hadn't seen since we were children. My sister, not the perfectly polished socialite she'd become, but the girl who used to sneak into my room during thunderstorms, who'd taught me to braid friendship bracelets, who'd held my hand when our parents' marriage had fallen apart. Thank you, she mouthed silently, and this time I could see that she meant it, not just for the popcorn or helping with the kids, but for staying, for not walking away when she'd given me every reason to. I settled onto the bed with the children, passing around the bowl of popcorn, and let myself enjoy the simple pleasure of watching a movie with family. Outside, November rain continued to drum against the windows of the big house in Myers Park, but inside Madison's room, we were warm and safe and together. It would be a long time before any of us forgot this Thanksgiving, But maybe, just maybe, it would turn out to be the beginning of something better than what we'd had before. Sometimes, I thought as Moana sang about the call of the ocean, it took a storm to wash away the things that were never really solid in the first place, leaving behind what was actually worth saving. And sometimes, justice didn't come in the form you expected. But it came all the same. I woke up the next morning in Madison's trundle bed, my back aching from the unfamiliar mattress, and my mind immediately flooding with memories of the night before. For a moment, I thought it might have been a strange dream. The arrest, the collapse of Brooke's perfect evening, the sight of my polished sister crumbling in her designer clothes. But then I heard voices downstairs, low and urgent, and reality came crashing back. Ava was still asleep beside me, her dark curls spread across the pink pillowcase, one small hand clutching the stuffed elephant she never traveled without. Madison and Tyler had eventually fallen asleep during the second movie, and Brooke had actually asked, not commanded, if we could stay the night. The house felt too big and empty with Richard gone, she'd said, and she didn't want the children to wake up alone. I slipped out of bed carefully, not wanting to wake the kids, and padded downstairs in my wrinkled dress from the night before. The voices were coming from the kitchen, and as I got closer, I could make out Brooke's voice along with a man's, deeper, older, unfamiliar. Absolutely critical that we control the narrative from the beginning, the man was saying as I paused in the hallway. The media will have this story by this afternoon, and we need to be prepared. I still can't believe this is happening, Brooke replied, her voice thick with exhaustion. David, you've known Richard for 15 years. He's not a criminal. There has to be some explanation. David, who I assumed was the lawyer Richard had mentioned, cleared his throat. Brooke, I understand this is difficult, but the evidence is substantial. Bank records, forged documents, witness testimony from colleagues. The FBI has been building this case for months. FBI. The word hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just some local police matter. This was federal, which meant it was serious in ways I was only beginning to understand. I entered the kitchen to find Brooke sitting at the marble island across from a distinguished man in his 60s, wearing an expensive suit. Coffee cups and legal documents were scattered between them, and Brooke looked like she hadn't slept at all. Her makeup was gone completely, revealing dark circles under her eyes, and she was wearing a Duke University sweatshirt that made her look younger and more vulnerable than I'd seen her in years. Danielle, she said, looking up with obvious relief. This is David Steinberg, Richard's attorney. David, this is my sister. David stood and shook my hand with the professional warmth of someone who dealt with family crises for a living. Pleasure to meet you, though I wish it were under better circumstances. How bad is it? I asked, accepting the coffee Brooke poured for me and taking a seat at the island. David exchanged a glance with Brooke before answering. Richard is being charged with embezzlement, wire fraud, and money laundering. The prosecution is alleging that he's been systematically stealing from client accounts for the past 3 years, using the money to fund a lifestyle beyond his legitimate income. I thought about the house around us, the marble floors, the crystal chandelier, the professional-grade kitchen, the children's expensive clothes and toys. How much money are we talking about? Over $2 million, David said quietly. And that's just what they've found so far. Brooke made a sound like she'd been physically hit. $2 million, that's impossible. Richard makes good money, but not. We live well, but we're not. Brooke, David interrupted gently. Your household expenses for the past 3 years have averaged about $40,000 a month. Richard's legitimate income from the firm, after taxes, was approximately $22,000 a month. The math was simple and devastating. I watched my sister's face as the implications sank in. Not just the legal consequences, but the realization that the life she'd been living, the social status she'd been so carefully maintaining, had been built on stolen money. What does this mean for the children? I asked, thinking about Madison and Tyler sleeping upstairs. That depends on several factors, David replied. The house will likely be seized as part of the asset forfeiture, since it appears to have been purchased partially with embezzled funds. The cars, jewelry, artwork, anything of significant value will be investigated and potentially confiscated. Brooke's coffee cup clattered against the marble as her hands began to shake. The house? They're going to take the house? Where are we supposed to live? There are options, David said carefully. Family, friends, rental properties. But yes, you'll need to make alternative arrangements, probably within the next few weeks. I found myself studying my sister's face as the full scope of her situation became clear. Everything she'd built her identity around, the house, the social status, the carefully curated image of success, was disappearing. She was about to become exactly what she'd always looked down on, a woman with limited means, dependent on others for help, forced to start over from nothing, just like I had been 3 years ago. What about Richard's parents? I asked. Harold mentioned something last night about arrangements for the children. David's expression darkened. The Halls have already contacted me about seeking emergency custody. They're arguing that given Richard's arrest and the family's financial instability, the children would be better off in their care. They can't do that, Brooke said immediately, her voice rising. Madison and Tyler are my children. I haven't done anything wrong. You're absolutely right, David assured her. But they have resources, and they're already positioning this as being in the children's best interests. We'll fight it, of course, but it would help if you could demonstrate stability. Employment, housing, that sort of thing. Employment, housing. The basic requirements of adult life that Brooke hadn't had to think about in years, if ever. She'd gone from her parents' a house to Duke to marriage to Richard, always supported by someone else's money. I don't know how to do any of this, Brooke whispered, pressing her hands to her face. I don't know how to get a job, or find an apartment, or... God, I don't even know how much groceries cost. What kind of mother does that make me? For a moment, the kitchen was silent except for the expensive clock ticking on the wall. Then I heard myself saying words I hadn't planned to say. Words that surprised me even as they came out of my mouth. You can stay with us. Both Brooke and David looked at me like I'd suggested flying to the moon. Me what? Brooke asked. You and the kids can stay with Ava and me, I repeated, my voice growing stronger as the idea took shape. It's not much, a 2-bedroom apartment in South End, but there's a pull-out couch in the living room, and we could make it work temporarily, until you figure things out. Brooke stared at me, her expression cycling through surprise, gratitude, and something that looked almost like horror. Danielle, I can't. Your apartment is so small, and you work so hard just to take care of Ava. It's not the Myers Park mansion, I said, unable to keep a slight edge out of my voice, but it's clean and safe, and the kids would have a roof over their heads while you get back on your feet. The irony wasn't lost on any of us. 24 hours ago, Brooke had been too embarrassed to let her important guests see Ava and me as equals. Now I was offering to take in her and her children, to share my modest resources with the sister who'd spent years treating me like a charity case. That's very generous, David said diplomatically, and it would certainly help with the custody situation. The Halls would have a harder time arguing instability if the children are in a stable home environment with family. Brooke was quiet for a long moment, staring down at her coffee. When she finally looked up, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. Why would you do that? She asked quietly. After how I treated you last night, after years of, why would you help me? It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself since the words had left my mouth. The truth was complicated, part genuine compassion, part family loyalty, and yes, part satisfaction at being the one in a position to offer help instead of needing it. Because that's what family does, I said finally, and because Madison and Tyler don't deserve to be punished for their parents' mistakes. Before Brooke could respond, we heard the sound of small feet on the stairs, followed by children's voices. A moment later, all 3 kids appeared in the kitchen doorway, Ava still in her dress from the night before, Madison in princess pajamas, and Tyler in a Charlotte Hornets t-shirt that probably cost more than my entire outfit. Is Daddy coming home for breakfast? Madison asked, looking around the kitchen hopefully. Brooke's face crumpled slightly, but she managed to keep her voice steady. No, sweetheart. He's going to be away for a while. Remember what we talked about last night? Madison's face fell, and Tyler crossed his arms over his chest with the stubborn expression of a 10-year-old trying not to cry. Are we in trouble too? Tyler asked. No, baby, Brooke said, getting up to pull both children into a hug. You're not in trouble. None of this is your fault. Ava, with her usual directness, looked at me and said, Mommy, are Madison and Tyler coming to live with us? We're talking about it, I said carefully. Would you like that? Ava nodded enthusiastically. Madison said she'd teach me to play her video games, and Tyler knows how to make paper airplanes that fly really far. It was such a perfectly kid response, focused on the fun possibilities, rather than the complicated adult reasons behind them. I found myself smiling despite everything. Well, I said, if they do come stay with us, We'll need to talk about house rules and sharing space. Our apartment is much smaller than this house." "How much smaller?" Madison asked with genuine curiosity. I thought about my 900-square-foot apartment compared to their 5,000-square-foot mansion. A lot smaller. But sometimes smaller can be cozier. David cleared his throat diplomatically. "Perhaps I should leave you all to discuss this privately. Brooke, I'll be in touch this afternoon about the arraignment schedule and next steps." After he left, the kitchen felt both larger and more intimate. Brooke busied herself making breakfast for the kids. Pancakes from a mix that had probably cost more than I typically spent on groceries in a week, while I helped set plates and find syrup. "Aunt Danielle," Tyler said as we sat down to eat, "why don't you have a big house like this?" It was an innocent question, but it hung in the air like a challenge. How do you explain economic inequality to a 10-year-old who'd never had to think about money? "Different people have different amounts of money," I said carefully. "Your parents had more than your mom and I do. But that doesn't make anyone better or worse. Just different. Will we be poor now?" Madison asked, her voice small. Brooke's fork froze halfway to her mouth, and I saw her struggling with how to answer. "You'll have less money than you're used to," I said honestly. "But you'll still have everything you really need. Food, clothes, a place to live, people who love you. Sometimes having less money means you have to be more creative about having fun, but it doesn't mean being sad all the time." Ava nodded seriously. "Like when we have movie nights at home instead of going to the theater, and we make popcorn and build forts with blankets." "That sounds fun," Madison said, brightening slightly. As we finished breakfast, I found myself watching Brooke try to navigate this new reality. She was struggling with basic things. She'd burned the first batch of pancakes because she wasn't used to cooking, and she seemed genuinely confused about where things were in her own kitchen, probably because she'd always had housekeeping help. But she was trying. And there was something both heartbreaking and admirable about watching my polished sister attempt to do ordinary things like pack school lunches and figure out what clothes the kids would need for the next few days. "The school," she said suddenly, her face paling. "Oh God, the kids' school. This is going to be all over the news and everyone will know." I could see her imagining it, the whispers in carpool lines, the carefully polite distance from other parents, the children's friends being instructed to avoid Madison and Tyler. In a way, it would be worse than my own divorce had been, because I'd never had that far to fall socially. "And kids are more resilient than you think," I said, "and real friends will stick around through hard times." "Easy for you to say," Brooke replied, then caught herself. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean—" "It's okay," I said, though her words stung. "You're right. It is easier for me to say, because I've already been where you're going. I know what it's like to lose everything and have to start over. And I'm still here." Brooke looked at me across the breakfast table, really looked at me, and I thought I saw a flicker of understanding in her eyes, maybe the first recognition that my experience, my poor life choices, might actually be valuable now. "How did you do it?" she asked quietly. "After David left, when you came back here with nothing. How did you get through it?" It was the first time she'd ever asked me about that period of my life, the first time she'd shown any interest in understanding rather than judging. "One day at a time," I said honestly. "Some days were terrible. Some days I cried in grocery store parking lots because I couldn't afford the kind of cereal Ava wanted. But gradually, it got easier. And eventually, I realized that the life I was building, even though it was smaller and harder, was actually mine in a way that my marriage never had been." Brooke nodded slowly, and I could see her trying to imagine a future that wasn't built on someone else's foundation. "The kids need to pack some things," she said finally. If we're really going to do this, if you're really willing to let us stay with you, they'll need clothes and school supplies, and we're really going to do this," I confirmed, surprising myself with how certain I sounded. "It won't be easy, and it won't be what any of us are used to, but we'll figure it out together." As the morning progressed, the reality of what we were undertaking began to sink in. My small apartment would now house 5 people instead of 2. Madison and Tyler would have to share the pull-out couch, at least initially. Everyone would have to adjust to a completely different way of living. Smaller spaces, tighter budgets, and the kind of practical cooperation that came with having limited resources. But as I watched the kids help each other pack, as I saw Ava excitedly planning how to rearrange her room to make space for Madison's toys, I realized that maybe this wasn't just about helping Brooke and her children through a crisis. Maybe it was about all of us learning what family really meant when everything else was stripped away. 3 weeks later, I stood in the kitchen of my small apartment, watching Brooke attempt to make scrambled eggs, while Madison and Tyler sat at our tiny dining table doing homework. The transformation had been remarkable and exhausting in equal measure. My sister, who 3 weeks ago had never cooked a meal or done a load of laundry, was slowly learning the basics of daily life that most people took for granted. "Mom, I can't concentrate with Tyler breathing so loud," Madison complained, not looking up from her math worksheet. "I'm not breathing loud," Tyler protested. "She's just being dramatic." "Both of you, take it down a notch," Brooke said, flipping the eggs with the careful concentration of someone still learning the technique. "Madison, if you need quiet, you can do homework in the bedroom." It was a small miracle that we'd made it work at all. The first week had been chaos. 5 people sharing one bathroom, kids stepping on each other trying to get ready for school, and Brooke having what I privately called reality shock when she discovered that our apartment didn't have a housekeeper, a gardener, or anyone else to handle the mundane tasks of daily life. But gradually, we'd found our rhythm. The kids had adapted with the flexibility that children possess, and Brooke was learning, slowly but surely, how to function in a world where money wasn't unlimited and help wasn't automatically available. "Danielle," Brooke said, turning from the stove with a plate of perfectly acceptable scrambled eggs, "I got a call back from that medical office today. They want me to come in for a second interview tomorrow." I looked up from where I was helping Ava with her reading homework, feeling a surge of genuine pride. Brooke had been job hunting for 2 weeks, a process that had been humbling for someone who'd never had to sell herself professionally. Her degree from Duke was impressive, but her lack of work experience outside of volunteer committees made finding employment challenging. "That's wonderful," I said. What position was it again?" "Administrative assistant at Carolina Women's Health," she replied, sitting down with her plate. "It's not much, just $32,000 a year, but it's a start." $32,000 had been my starting salary at the dental office 4 years ago. I remembered thinking it was barely enough to survive on, but watching Brooke's face as she said the number, I could see her genuine gratitude for the opportunity. 3 weeks of living on my income, and whatever savings she had left had given her a crash course in financial reality. "That's great, Mom," Tyler said, looking up from his history worksheet. "Does that mean we can get our own apartment soon?" It was a question that had been hanging in the air for days. While we'd made the current arrangement work, 5 people in 900 square feet was pushing the limits of everyone's patience and privacy. But Brooke's face fell slightly at the question. "Well, honey, even if I get the job, I'll need to save up for deposits and first month's rent, and we'll need to find a place that's affordable but still in a good school district for you and Madison." I'd been doing the math in my head for days. Even with a full-time job, Brooke would be looking at a significant lifestyle adjustment. The apartment she could afford would be nothing like the Myers Park mansion, and the children would have to continue adjusting to a very different way of life. "What about the house?" Madison asked quietly. "Is there any chance we could get it back?" Brooke and I exchanged glances. The house had been officially seized by the FBI the week before, along with Richard's cars, Brooke's jewelry, and most of their valuable possessions. Walking through it one last time to collect personal items had been devastating for all of them. "No, sweetheart," Brooke said gently. "The house is gone. But you know what? We're going to find a new place that's ours, and we're going to make new memories there." It was the right thing to say, but I could see the loss in Madison's eyes. She was only 8, and losing her home, her familiar room, her princess castle. It was a lot for a little girl to process. "Madison," Ava said suddenly, looking up from her book, "when we move to our new apartment, can I help you decorate your new room? We could make it even prettier than your old one." Madison's face brightened slightly. "Really? You'd help me?" "Of course. And maybe we could have sleepovers sometimes, since we'll be neighbors again instead of roommates." It was such a perfectly Ava thing to say, optimistic and practical at the same time, focused on the possibilities rather than the losses. I felt a surge of pride in my daughter's resilience and kindness. The phone rang, interrupting the homework session. Brooke's face tightened with the anxiety that had become automatic whenever the phone rang. These days, calls were usually from lawyers, reporters, or creditors. "I'll get it," I said, reaching for the cordless phone. "Hello? Is this Danielle Cooper?" The voice was unfamiliar. Professional. "Yes, this is Danielle. This is Janet Morrison from Morrison Development Group. I'm calling about your sister, Brooke Cooper Hall." My blood ran cold. Morrison Development was Richard's company, the one he'd allegedly embezzled from. I couldn't imagine why they'd be calling me. What about my sister? I asked carefully, watching Brooke's face go white as she realized who was on the phone. Well, this is somewhat unusual, but we've been reviewing the case files, and we discovered something that might interest you both. Could you and Mrs. Cooper Hall come in for a meeting tomorrow? Say 2 o'clock. Can you tell me what this is about? I'd rather discuss it in person, but I will say this. It concerns some financial irregularities that predate your brother-in-law's employment with our company. Things that might change the scope of his culpability. I looked at Brooke, who was staring at me with an expression of desperate hope mixed with fear. We'll be there, I said. After I hung up, the kitchen was silent except for the sound of pencils on paper as the kids continued their homework, oblivious to the potential significance of the call. What did they want? Brooke whispered. A meeting tomorrow. Something about financial irregularities that happened before Richard started working there. Brooke's hands flew to her mouth. Do you think, could it mean he's not guilty? Or not as guilty as they thought? I don't know, I said honestly, but we'll find out tomorrow. That night, after the kids were asleep, Madison and Tyler on the pull-out couch, Ava in her bed, and Brooke on an air mattress in the living room, my sister and I sat on the tiny balcony of my apartment, sharing a bottle of cheap wine and looking out over the South End skyline. I keep thinking about Thanksgiving, Brooke said quietly, about how I treated you and Ava, about that stupid separate table. I took a sip of wine, remembering the humiliation of that evening, the careful explanation of why we weren't good enough to sit with the respectable people. I was so focused on appearances, she continued, on making sure everything looked perfect for Richard's parents, for the Weatherbys. I was so worried about what they'd think of our family that I forgot what family actually means. You were protecting your world, I said. I understand that. But it wasn't really my world, was it? Brooke laughed bitterly. It was all built on stolen money, on lies, and the people I was so desperate to impress. They disappeared the minute things got difficult. The Weatherbys won't return my calls. The Montgomerys cross the street when they see me. Even the Junior League asked me to step down from my committees. I thought about James Weatherby and his wife, about how quickly they'd fled the scene once Richard was arrested. Fair-weather friends. My mother used to call people like that. The people who matter stick around, I said. Like Mrs. Henderson from downstairs who brings us cookies, or Dr. Martinez who's been flexible about my schedule while you've been job hunting. Real community isn't about how much money you have. Brooke nodded, staring out at the city lights. I owe you an apology, she said finally. Not just for Thanksgiving, but for years of looking down on you, of treating you like your life was less valuable because it was smaller or harder. I was wrong. It was the apology I'd been waiting years to hear, but now that it came, I found I didn't need it as much as I'd thought I would. We were both doing the best we could with what we knew, I said, and now we know better. Do you think the kids will be okay? She asked. Really okay. I mean, not just surviving, but actually happy. I thought about Madison teaching Ava to braid friendship bracelets that afternoon, about Tyler helping with dinner without being asked, about how the 3 children had started functioning like siblings rather than cousins. I think they're going to be more than okay, I said. They're learning things they never would have learned in the Myers Park bubble. Resilience, empathy, the value of things that can't be bought. Like what? Like the fact that Tyler volunteered to give up his allowance to help buy groceries. Or that Madison spent her own birthday money on a present for Ava last week. Or that they both help with chores without complaining, because they understand that everyone has to pitch in when resources are limited. Brooke smiled for the first time in days. They are pretty amazing, aren't they? They get it from their mom, I said. You've handled this better than I expected. Honestly, 3 weeks ago, you didn't know how to work a washing machine. Now you're cooking dinner and helping with homework and job hunting and managing all of this chaos. I had a good teacher, she said, looking at me with something I hadn't seen in her eyes in years. Genuine respect. The next day, we sat in the conference room at Morrison Development Group, facing Janet Morrison across a polished table that reminded me uncomfortably of Brooke's old dining room. Janet was a woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and the kind of direct manner that suggested she didn't waste time on pleasantries. Thank you both for coming, she said, opening a thick file folder. As I mentioned on the phone, we've discovered some irregularities that predate Mr. Hall's employment with our company. She pulled out a series of documents and spread them across the table. It appears that the embezzlement scheme Mr. Hall was involved in was actually initiated by his predecessor, Martin Kendrick. Mr. Hall discovered the ongoing theft about 18 months ago. Brooke leaned forward, her face pale. What are you saying? According to these documents, which include recorded phone conversations and email exchanges, Mr. Hall initially tried to report the theft through proper channels. However, Mr. Kendrick had evidence that implicated several senior partners in the firm, including Mr. Hall's direct supervisor. Janet pulled out another document. Mr. Kendrick basically blackmailed your husband into silence, threatening to frame him for the entire scheme if he reported it. Instead, he forced Mr. Hall to become complicit, using him as a scapegoat while the real architects of the embezzlement continued their activities. I felt like the room was spinning. So Richard was, what? Innocent. Not innocent, Janet clarified. Goons, he did participate in the embezzlement for the past 18 months, but he was coerced into it, and the amount he actually stole was significantly less than originally alleged, closer to 400,000 rather than 2 million. Brooke's hands were shaking. Why didn't he tell me? Why didn't he explain this from the beginning? Janet's expression softened slightly. According to his statements to the FBI, he was terrified. Kendrick had threatened not just him, but your family. He was trying to gather evidence to expose the whole scheme when the investigation caught up with him. What does this mean? I asked. For the charges? For the house? For everything? It means the case is being significantly revised. The FBI is now investigating the entire firm, and Mr. Hall's cooperation is proving valuable in exposing the full scope of the fraud. His charges will likely be reduced to a misdemeanor, with the possibility of house arrest rather than prison time. Brooke burst into tears, not the careful, restrained crying she'd been doing for weeks, but huge, gulping sobs of relief and grief and confusion all mixed together. The house, she managed to ask through her tears, will likely be returned, minus what was purchased with the funds your husband actually stole. You'll have to refinance to compensate for that amount, but the property itself should be restored to you. As we drove home from the meeting, Brooke was quiet, processing the dramatic reversal of everything she'd believed about her life. I don't know how to feel, she said finally. Relief that Richard isn't the criminal I thought he was, but also anger that he didn't trust me enough to tell me what was happening. Maybe he was trying to protect you, I suggested. Maybe he thought if you didn't know, you couldn't be implicated. Or maybe he thought I was too shallow to handle the truth, she said bitterly. Maybe he thought I'd leave him if our lifestyle was threatened. I thought about the woman Brooke had been 3 weeks ago, so focused on appearances, so invested in maintaining her social status. Would that version of my sister have been able to handle the truth? Does it matter now? I asked. You've both learned things about yourselves that you might not have learned any other way. When we got back to the apartment, the kids were waiting with Mrs. Henderson, who'd agreed to watch them during our meeting. Their faces were anxious. They'd been through enough upheaval to know that unexpected meetings usually meant more changes. Kids, sit down, Brooke said, her voice shaky but hopeful. We have some news about Daddy. As she explained what we'd learned, in age-appropriate terms, I watched the children's faces transform from worry to confusion to cautious hope. So Daddy's not a bad guy? Madison asked. Daddy made some mistakes, Brooke said carefully, but he was trying to do the right thing in a very difficult situation, and he's going to come home much sooner than we thought. What about our house? Tyler asked. We're going to get it back, Brooke said, then quickly added, but it's going to be different. We're going to live differently, more simply, and we're going to appreciate things we took for granted before. That evening, as we packed up the few belongings the kids had brought to my apartment, there was a bittersweet quality to the preparations. In some ways, I was sorry to see them go. Despite the chaos and crowding, the past 3 weeks had brought us closer as a family than we'd been in years. Danielle, Brooke said as she folded Madison's clothes, I want you to know, this isn't ending just because we're getting the house back. This family we've built here, this closeness, I don't want to lose that. Neither do I said honestly. And I want you to move back to Myers Park. Not to the mansion. We'll probably have to sell that and get something smaller anyway. But to the neighborhood. There are some nice condos and townhouses that would be perfect for you and Ava. I started to protest about money, but Brooke held up her hand. Richard's going to have to make restitution, and our finances will be tight for years. But we have enough to help with a down payment for you, and the schools are so much better for Ava. It was a generous offer, and one that would have felt like charity 3 weeks ago. but now it felt like family taking care of family, the way it should have been all along. "I'll think about it," I said, as I tucked Ava into bed that night, her last night sharing a room with me for a while. She looked up at me with those big, curious eyes. "Mommy, are you sad that Madison and Tyler are leaving?" "A little," I admitted, "but I'm also happy that their family is going to be together again." "Will we still see them a lot?" "I think we'll see them more than we ever did before," I said, smoothing her hair, "because now we know what really matters." "What's that?" "That family isn't about having the biggest house or the fanciest things. It's about being there for each other when things get hard, and celebrating together when things get better." Ava nodded seriously, then brightened, "And having movie nights and eating ice cream for dinner sometimes." "Definitely that too," I laughed, kissing her forehead. As I lay in bed that night, I thought about the strange journey that had brought us here, from that humiliating Thanksgiving dinner to this moment of genuine family connection. Karma, I realized, hadn't just been about Richard's arrest or Brooke's fall from grace. It had been about all of us learning who we really were when everything else was stripped away. And what we'd discovered was that we were stronger together than any of us had been apart. 1 year later, I stood in the kitchen of my new townhouse in Myers Park, watching through the window as Ava and Madison built a snowman in the backyard. It was the day before Thanksgiving, and for the first time in years, I was looking forward to the holiday instead of dreading it. So much had changed since that awful dinner that had started this whole journey. Richard had been sentenced to 18 months of house arrest and community service, along with full restitution of the money he'd actually taken. The reduced charges meant he was home with his family, working with the FBI to prosecute the real architects of the embezzlement scheme. It hadn't been easy. He'd struggled with depression and guilt over the choices he'd made, even under coercion, but family therapy and time had helped heal those wounds. Brooke had gotten the job at Carolina Women's Health and had proven to be surprisingly good at it. Her natural organizational skills and her newfound empathy, born from her own struggles, made her excellent at helping other women navigate difficult situations. She'd been promoted twice and was now the office manager, making enough to support her family in their smaller but comfortable home. The Myers Park mansion had been sold, as we'd expected. In its place, Brooke and Richard had bought a modest 4-bedroom colonial just 6 blocks from my new townhouse. It was probably a quarter the size of their old house, but it felt warmer somehow, more like a home than a showcase. "Aunt Danielle," Madison's voice called from the backyard. "Come help us. Our snowman is lopsided." I smiled, wiping my hands on the dish towel and heading for the back door. The townhouse Brooke had helped me buy was perfect for Ava and me. 2 bedrooms, a small yard, and most importantly, it was in the same school district as Madison and Tyler. The 3 children had become inseparable over the past year, more like siblings than cousins. Outside, the November snow was the wet, heavy kind that was perfect for snowman building but terrible for everything else. Ava and Madison were bundling snow around what was clearly meant to be the middle section of their creation, while Tyler worked on rolling what would become the head. "It's not lopsided," I said, examining their work critically. "It's just artistic. That's what Mom says when my drawings are messy." Madison giggled, her cheeks pink from the cold. "Speaking of your mom, where is she? I thought she was coming over to help with pie prep." "She's at home arguing with Dad about the guest list for tomorrow," Tyler said, looking up from his snowball. "Again." I sighed. This had been an ongoing discussion for weeks. Richard wanted a small, quiet Thanksgiving with just our immediate family. Brooke wanted to invite a few friends, not the Weatherbys or Montgomerys, who had long since written them off, but newer friends she'd made through work and the kids' hunt school. People who knew their story and didn't judge them for it. "What kind of arguing?" I asked carefully. "The kind where they use quiet voices but their faces look mad," Ava said with the observational skills of a 7-year-old who'd learned to read adult emotions carefully. I made a mental note to text Brooke later. Richard's house arrest had officially ended 6 months ago, but he was still struggling with social anxiety, particularly around hosting or attending gatherings. The shame of what had happened, even though he'd been largely a victim himself, was something he was still working through in therapy. My phone buzzed with a text from Brooke. "Emergency pie consultation needed. Richard is insisting we make everything from scratch like Martha Stewart. Send help." I laughed, showing the text to the kids. "Looks like your mom needs backup. Want to go save your dad from becoming a pie perfectionist?" 20 minutes later, we were trudging through the snow to Brooke's house, the kids running ahead while I carried a bag of pre-made pie crusts that would hopefully restore domestic peace. The house looked warm and inviting, with smoke curling from the chimney and golden light spilling from the windows. I found Brooke and Richard in their kitchen, much smaller than the old one, but somehow more functional, surrounded by flour, rolling pins, and what appeared to be the remnants of several failed pie crusts. "Thank God you're here," Brooke said, looking frazzled. "Richard has decided that store-bought pie crust is somehow an insult to our guests, but neither of us actually knows how to make decent crust from scratch." Richard looked up from the counter where he was wrestling with a particularly stubborn ball of dough, flour in his hair and frustration written across his face. "I just want everything to be perfect," he said. "And after last year, after everything that happened, I want people to feel welcome and comfortable in our home." It was sweet, really, how much he cared about making amends for the disaster of the previous Thanksgiving. But I could see the perfectionist anxiety that had gotten him into trouble in the first place starting to creep back in. "Richard," I said gently, setting my bag on the counter, "the people who are coming tomorrow aren't coming for perfect pies. They're coming because they care about your family. But what if they judge us? What if they think we're doing this wrong, or that we're trying too hard to prove something?" Brooke and I exchanged glances. This was the heart of Richard's struggle, the fear that everyone was watching, waiting for him to fail again, ready to pass judgment on every choice he made. "Who exactly is coming tomorrow?" I asked, pulling out my store-bought crusts. "Janet Morrison and her husband," Brooke said, beginning to clean flour off the counter. "Dr. Martinez and his wife, the Hendersons from your old building, Sarah and Mike from the kids' school, and Mrs. Patterson from down the street." I nodded, mentally going through the list. All good people, all folks who had shown genuine kindness and support over the past year. Janet Morrison had become an unexpected friend after working with Richard through the legal proceedings. Dr. Martinez had been like a second father to me, and his wife Maria made the best tamales in Charlotte. The others were the kind of solid, unpretentious people who formed the backbone of real community. "Richard," I said, "these people have seen you at your worst, and they're still choosing to spend Thanksgiving with you. They're not coming to judge your pie crust. They're coming because they've watched you work to rebuild your life, and they want to celebrate that with you." He stopped wrestling with the dough and looked at me, really looked at me, the way he'd started doing over the past year, like I was someone whose opinion actually mattered. "You really think so? I know so. And you know what? Even if the pies are disasters, it'll make a good story. Sometimes the best gatherings are the ones where everything goes slightly wrong, but nobody cares because they're just happy to be together." Richard's shoulders relaxed slightly, and he managed a small smile. "Store-bought crust it is, then." As we worked together to assemble pies, pumpkin, apple, and a chocolate cream that was Ava's favorite, I found myself marveling at how different this felt from the careful orchestration of Brooke's old dinner parties. There was no anxiety about impressing anyone, no careful calculation of social points, just family working together to create something welcoming and warm. "Danielle," Brooke said as we waited for the pies to bake, "I've been meaning to ask you something." "What's that?" "Would you consider doing the blessing tomorrow, before dinner?" I looked at her in surprise. Brooke had always been the one to handle the formal aspects of family gatherings, the speeches and toasts and ceremonial moments. "Are you sure? That's usually your thing." "I think it should be yours this time," she said quietly. "You're the one who held this family together when everything fell apart. You're the one who taught us what really matters." Richard nodded in agreement. "Brooke's right. None of us would be here, together, happy, actually functioning as a family, if it weren't for you." I felt my throat tighten with unexpected emotion. A year ago, I had been the family disappointment, the one whose presence had to be carefully managed. Now they were asking me to speak for all of us, to set the tone for our gathering. "I'd be honored," I said. Thanksgiving Day dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of brilliant blue sky that made the leftover snow sparkle like diamonds. I spent the morning in my own kitchen, making the green bean casserole that had become my signature dish, while Ava helped by taste testing everything and providing running commentary on the cooking process. "Mom, do you think this Thanksgiving will be better than last year?" she asked as we loaded the casserole into the car. It was such a loaded question, coming from a 7-year-old who had witnessed both the disaster of the previous year and the gradual healing that had followed. "What do you think?" I asked, wanting to hear her perspective. "I think it'll be different," she said thoughtfully. "Last year was scary and sad, but also kind of exciting because everything changed. This year feels safer, like we know who we are now. Out of the mouths of babes, Ava had perfectly captured something I'd been struggling to articulate, that sense of finally feeling settled in our own skins, comfortable with who we were, rather than trying to be someone else. Brooke and Richard's house was already bustling when we arrived. Janet Morrison was in the kitchen helping with last-minute preparations, while her husband Bob entertained the kids with stories from his days as a high school football coach. Dr. Martinez and Maria had brought enough tamales to feed an army, and Mrs. Henderson was setting up a card table for the children, but this time, it was because they'd asked for their own table, wanting to feel grown-up and independent. The difference from the previous year was striking. Instead of careful social choreography, there was genuine warmth and laughter. Instead of expensive china and crystal, we were using a mix of everyday dishes and borrowed plates, and somehow it felt more festive than all of Brooke's old formal settings. Sarah and Mike from the school arrived with their twin boys, who immediately joined the kid table chaos. Mrs. Patterson brought homemade rolls that smelled like heaven, and a bottle of wine that she admitted she'd gotten from the grocery store, but didn't care because it tastes fine and it was on sale. As we gathered around the table, adults at the main table, kids at their own table by choice rather than exclusion, I looked around at the faces surrounding us. These weren't people who had impressive careers or social connections. They were people who had shown up, who had offered help without being asked, who had become family through choice rather than obligation. "Before we eat," Brooke announced, "Danielle has agreed to say a few words." I stood up, my heart racing slightly. A year ago, I would have been terrified to speak in front of people, but this wasn't a performance. It was just family. "I was thinking about what I wanted to say today," I began, and I kept coming back to the idea of gratitude, not just the obvious things we're grateful for, but the unexpected gifts that sometimes come disguised as disasters. I looked at Richard, who was listening intently, his face calm in a way it hadn't been for years. A year ago, our family was broken in ways we didn't even realize. We were so focused on appearances, on maintaining images, that we'd forgotten how to actually take care of each other. It took a crisis to strip away all the pretense and show us who we really were underneath. I glanced at Brooke, who was wiping away tears but smiling. This year, I'm grateful for second chances, for learning that love isn't about having the biggest house or the most expensive dinner. It's about showing up when things get hard. It's about making room at your table, literally and figuratively, for the people who matter, regardless of their circumstances. I looked at the children's table, where Madison was helping one of the twins cut his turkey, while Ava entertained the group with an animated story. I'm grateful for kids who teach us that resilience isn't about avoiding difficulties, but about finding joy and connection even in the middle of them. And I'm grateful for friends who become family, and family who learn to be friends. I raised my water glass, and everyone else followed suit. So here's to imperfect families, imperfect dinners, and the perfectly imperfect love that holds it all together. "Cheers," came the chorus of voices, and we clinked glasses around the table, water glasses and wine glasses and coffee mugs, because we didn't have enough matching stemware and nobody cared. As dinner progressed, I found myself marveling at how natural everything felt. Conversations flowed easily between topics both serious and silly. Dr. Martinez told stories about his early days as an immigrant doctor, while Maria shared tamale-making secrets with anyone who wanted to learn. The kids' table erupted in periodic laughter, and the adults found themselves listening in on their conversations as much as focusing on their own. Richard, I noticed, was more relaxed than I'd seen him in months. The anxiety that had been his constant companion was still there, but it was manageable now, part of him rather than controlling him. He was telling Bob Morrison about his community service work teaching financial literacy to low-income families, something that had started as part of his sentence but had become a genuine passion. "It's weird," he was saying, "but I think I'm actually better at this than I ever was at the high-stakes development deals. There's something about helping people understand money basics that feels more meaningful than helping rich people get richer. Maybe because you're using your skills to build people up instead of just building wealth," Janet observed. "There's a big difference." After dinner, as we were clearing dishes and transitioning to dessert, Brooke pulled me aside in the kitchen. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything, for last year, for today, for showing me what family really means." "Thank you for letting me," I replied, "for trusting me with your kids when everything fell apart, for including me in rebuilding everything. We wouldn't have been able to rebuild without you," she said. "You were the foundation we didn't even know we needed." As the afternoon wore on, the gathering took on the comfortable, sprawling quality of the best family dinners. Kids migrated between the adult table and their own, sharing dessert and stories and gradually wearing themselves out with post-dinner games. Adults lingered over coffee and pie, the conversations growing more intimate as the day progressed. Mrs. Patterson shared stories about her late husband and how she'd learned to create new traditions after his death. Dr. Martinez talked about the early days of his practice, when he'd treated patients who paid him with vegetables from their gardens because they didn't have cash. Janet and Bob told us about their decision to downsize their own lifestyle after watching Richard's ordeal, realizing they'd been caught up in the same kind of status-driven spending that had made Richard vulnerable to Kendrick's blackmail. As evening approached and people began to gather their coats and leftover containers, I realized that this was what I'd been searching for my whole life without knowing it. Not the perfect family dinner with the perfect table settings and the perfect guests, but this messy, authentic, generous gathering of people who genuinely cared about each other. "Aunt Danielle," Madison said as she hugged me goodbye, "next year can we have Thanksgiving at your house?" "We'll see, sweetheart," I said, but the idea made me smile. A year ago, the thought of hosting Thanksgiving would have terrified me. I didn't have the right dishes, the right space, the right anything. Now I realized that none of that mattered. What mattered was the willingness to open your door and your heart to the people you loved. As Ava and I walked home through the November evening, the snow crunching under our feet and the stars beginning to appear in the clear sky, my daughter slipped her mittened hand into mine. "Mom," she said, "I think this was the best Thanksgiving ever. Really, even better than when we ate ice cream for dinner last year because we didn't have anywhere else to go." She considered this seriously. That was good too, but this was better because we had family there. Real family, not just people who are related to us. Once again, my 7-year-old had managed to articulate something profound with perfect simplicity. Family wasn't just about blood relations or legal connections. It was about the people who showed up, who made room for you at their table, who celebrated with you when things went well and stood by you when things went wrong. As we reached our townhouse, I looked back toward Brooke's house, where warm light still glowed in the windows and I could see figures moving around, cleaning up and settling in for the evening. In a few hours, we'd all be in our own homes, living our own lives. But we'd be connected by something stronger than proximity or shared genetics. We'd be connected by the choice to keep showing up for each other, no matter what. A year ago, Karma had shown up uninvited to Brooke's perfect dinner party, disrupting her carefully constructed world and forcing all of us to confront who we really were beneath the surface. But karma, I'd learned, wasn't just about punishment or payback. Sometimes it was about restoration, about second chances, about finding your way back to what really mattered. Sometimes karma looked like a 7-year-old, teaching her cousins that it was okay to be sad about losing things, as long as you stayed open to finding new things to love. Sometimes it looked like a sister learning to ask for help instead of always having to be perfect. Sometimes it looked like a man finding meaning in his mistakes and using them to help others avoid the same pitfalls. And sometimes, karma looked like a simple family dinner where everyone had enough, everyone was welcome, and everyone understood that the real feast wasn't on the table. It was in the love that had brought us all together. As I tucked Ava into bed that night, she looked up at me with those thoughtful eyes and asked, "Mom, do you think Daddy would have liked our Thanksgiving today?" It was a question she asked sometimes, wondering about the father who had left when she was 3 and hadn't seen fit to maintain contact since. Usually, it made my heart ache for what she'd lost. But tonight, surrounded by the warmth of the day we'd shared, I felt only gratitude for what we'd found. "I think he would have loved seeing how happy and kind and smart you are," I said honestly. "And I think he would have been amazed at how much love can fit around one table when everyone makes room for everyone else." She nodded sleepily, satisfied with that answer, and I kissed her forehead before turning off the light. As I settled into my own bed, I thought about the journey that had brought us here, from that humiliating Thanksgiving dinner to this day of genuine celebration and connection. It hadn't been a straight path, and it certainly hadn't been easy, but it had led us exactly where we needed to be. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and joys. There would be work and school and all the ordinary struggles of daily life. But tonight, I fell asleep knowing that whatever came next, we wouldn't face it alone. We had family, not the kind that was imposed by genetics or circumstance, but the kind that was chosen and nurtured and strengthened by shared experience. And that, I thought as sleep took me, was the greatest blessing of all.